Thank you for that. So, as you mentioned, a double major in classics and philosophy, which, as the current students can imagine, made the philosophy versus classics kickball game a whole lot of fun. So like many of you, I'm sure you encountered that question of what are you going to do with your philosophy major? While I was here, I was fortunate enough to have a very easy answer to that. I joined the Army. So moving into that, the first 4 years, what I've been doing up until about a few months ago was working in the field artillery. Now, to be completely honest with you, playing with cannons, while my inner 3-year-old was very happy with that, doesn't really lend itself to a whole lot of cognitive thinking. Not to disparage them a whole lot, I'm still proud of my Red Leg heritage. But for the last 3 or 4 months, I've been at the intelligence school for the Army down at Fort Huachuca in Arizona. Very hot, very beautiful, very sunny, and I will wish I was back here when summer comes. In that, the intelligence professional uses a process that we call intelligence preparation of the battlefield. That is our quote-unquote Swiss Army knife, the one skill that we need to have that we can apply to most of what we do. Now, in that, we try to evaluate what the opponent is going to do on the battlefield using what we know about the terrain, what we know about his or her preferences as far as tactics, as far as equipment and everything goes, in order to try and make a prediction about what is going to happen. Now, you stepped out a minute ago, but Jeff mentioned George's logic book a little while ago. Thank you for coming back. Mentioned George's logic book about that a little while ago, that one. And in that, he outlines 2 different ideas, soundness versus validity, separating out an argument from the structure of the arguments towards the meaning of the argument. So in simplest terms, imagine 2 premises followed by its conclusion. Premise 1, the capital of Minnesota is either Minneapolis or St. Paul. The capital is Minneapolis. Therefore, the capital is not St. Paul, therefore the capital is Minneapolis. From the simple structure of that argument, that would seem to make a whole lot of sense. But as most of you, I'm sure, know, the capital is not Minneapolis. It is, in fact, St. Paul. So it takes someone who has a better understanding of what's going on in order to try and come to that conclusion and to do so correctly. You can't simply rely on the structure of an argument. The intelligence preparation of the battlefield is very similar to that. Aside from just walking up to the opponent general and saying, hey you, what's your plan, what are you about to do, you can't really figure out what it's going to be. So you have to take what is essentially the validity of your analysis and try and use that to guess as best as you can as to what is actually going to happen. Now, excuse me. Earlier today, I heard a couple of other speakers mention that every now and again they have this one moment of clarity when this one thing that they learned in school suddenly flashes to the light and suddenly becomes perfectly applicable to what they're doing. Now, a few years ago, I happened to have a very similar such experience. Plato's Republic. I'm sure all of you have heard of it at the very least, and hopefully most of you have read it. I think it's towards the beginning on like page 5 or something like that. He talks about how to try and apply justice, and I heard it mentioned earlier today as well. The one example that he used was a passing line as far as Socrates' arguments went, but he asked the question of if someone is not capable of preventing harm coming to him or herself by his own actions, would you take away his weapons or would you at the very least not give them back had he lent them to you? Now, in the Army, we have a very uncomfortable position sometimes. The commander is responsible for the health, the safety, and the welfare of the soldiers under his or her command. And having found myself in a very similar position to that, I had a soldier who was having a lot of problems in his personal life, and I recommended to him that he give up his weapons and we store them safely in our arms room in order to prevent him from making some kind of a bad decision in his life that he would probably regret later on. So that same soldier is the crux of what it is that I really want to talk about. We have, as part of a command function, the responsibility to try and help our soldiers become better people. And when they don't become better people, we are sometimes in a very uncomfortable position of having to adjudicate some kind of punishment against them. It's not a whole lot of fun, but we have to do it anyway sometimes. To that end, we try to apply whatever ethical model that we have personally to try and give justice to that person in the manner that we can best. So, a few years ago, I came across a statement by a professor from West Point who described the Army's professional ethic as a set of deontic constraints applied to the utilitarian imperative of mission accomplishment. It's a compact sentence. It's a fun sentence, and I've spent a lot of time trying to figure out exactly what it means. Personally, I think it's fairly accurate. Utilitarianism, thank you for shortening my talk by about an extra 30 seconds or so. So we'll skip most of that, but as he said, it's the greatest amount of good for the greatest number of people. Compare that to a deontological approach, which is basically saying, these are your set of rules, and whatever action is in accordance with those rules is therefore a right action. I understand I'm oversimplifying things grossly, but as has been mentioned before, we only have so much time to stand up here and talk about things. So, trying to adjudicate this kind of punishment, you can take any of those approaches. So let's start with a deontological one. What are the rules of our army? Well, we have our customs, our traditions, our unique way of doing things. We have the rules and the regulations that apply to our actions. We have the Uniform Code of Military Justice, the set of laws that's passed by Congress by which we must accord ourselves. We have the directives and the instructions of the President of the United States, and we have above that, of course, the laws of our country and the Constitution itself. So I can look at the soldier and say, you've messed up. You've messed up pretty badly. So these are the rules, this is the punishment that you have to go, and just leave it at that, and not really try and understand what problem that soldier is experiencing at the time. Or I can take a more utilitarian approach and say, I have a responsibility to the Army. I must do whatever action to the soldier is best for the good of the Army. I can recommend that he go to some kind of a self-help program, or I can kick him out, basically, if he screws up too much or refuses to try and help himself get better. But that doesn't really necessarily give justice to the soldier in the best possible way that would help the soldier become a better person. So that deontic constraints towards the utilitarian imperative generally isn't sufficient, as I've found. Instead, you have to take a more personalized approach and try and understand the person as an individual, to try and understand what his or her problems are. So to go back to the soldier that I mentioned earlier, recommending that he surrender his weapons to us for the arms room, he had a problem showing up on time. Show up late one day, that's fine, mistakes happen, we don't worry about it too much. Show up twice, things are getting a little personal, so we just take them aside, like, hey, you gotta show up. Those are the rules, you can't really get around them. Shows up a third time, fourth time, fifth time, late each and every single time, we start to have a real problem. We can't really accept that kind of behavior anymore. So I can take a deontological approach. It says, you showed up late this many times, therefore you must have extra duty and we're gonna dock your pay a little bit. Detention, for all intents and purposes. And that's what it is. But does that really understand why the soldier is late? Well, as it turns out, the soldier had a drinking problem. So he would, of course, drink every single night, could have problems getting up in the morning, and therefore couldn't show up on time. So I take a utilitarian approach, try and make the soldier as good as he can possibly be for the benefit of the Army. So get him into a self-help program, a substance abuse program, or AA, something like that. Or if he refuses to go to that, which he, of course, has the option to do, we can say, thanks for your service, have a wonderful day, good luck. Which, personally, I don't like all that much as well. So as I mentioned, those two approaches simply isn't adequate for what it is that we're trying to do. So we take a more personal approach, and going back to Plato, we stop and think, what is justice? What action can I take that is the best outcome for this soldier? Well, it turns out the soldier didn't really have a drinking problem. He was using drinking to cope with the stress of a failing marriage, of a new child that he just didn't know how to take care of best. And so the best way to serve justice, to do the best thing for the soldier, was to get him into a marriage counseling program, to set up a kind of daycare. The lesson that I took from being a philosophy major at the school is don't always assume that you know what's going on. Stop and reflect. So going back to my classics roots, the phrase nothi seauton, Greek, hello, wonderful language, written above a temple in Delphi. It translates to know yourself. Its imperative is simply to stop and reflect, to understand who you are, how you fit inside the world, and how you can best fit both yourself and the people around you to create a better community and a better world, not to sound too cheesy. That kind of self-reflective imperative doesn't necessarily apply only to yourself, but applies to everything that you see around you. Thank you.